John chapter 2 New Wine and New Temple. John chapter 2 contains two scenes that seems to have almost nothing to do with each other. The first take place in a small village in Galilee, a family wedding, where the wine runs out and Jesus quietly solves the problem. It is a warm, domestic, almost gentle. The second take place in Jerusalem, in the temple court, where Jesus makes a whip out of cord and drives out the animals and overturns the money changer's table. It is loud, public, and confrontational. A wedding and a riot. Why would John put them side by side at the very start of his gospel, with almost nothing between them? Because they answer the same questions. Both scenes ask what happened when Jesus arrives inside the existing religious order, and both give the same answer. Something old is coming to an end, and something new is arriving in his person. In Cana, the water of purification becomes wine. In Jerusalem, the temple itself is going to be replaced by his body. Chapter 2 is an announcement that a new age has begun, and that new age is not a program or a movement, it is him. Let us walk through it. On the third day, the chapter opens with a time marker. On the third day, where there was wedding in Cana in Galilee. The third day from what? If you look back to chapter 1, John has been counting days. 3 times he writes the next day. When John the Baptist sees Jesus approaching, when he points out the lamb again, and when Jesus finds Philip, follows that sequence, and the wedding falls on the third day after the last one mentioned. John has quietly given us an opening week, and it is difficult to believe that a writer who opens his gospel with "in the beginning" is counting days without meaning anything by it. Genesis begins with a week of creation. John begins with a week too. And it culminates in a wedding and a display of glory. And the third day is not a neutral phrase in the New Testament. Before this chapter ends, Jesus will say that if you destroy this temple in 3 days, he will raise it up. And first sign is already standing in the light of the resurrection. Now the setting. A wedding in a first-century Galilean village is not an afternoon event. It was a celebration that could last a full week, and the host family was responsible for feeding and supplying everyone. Running out of wine is not a minor inconvenience. It is a social humiliation that the family might not live down for years. But John is not primarily interested in the family's embarrassment. He is interested in what wine means. Throughout the Old Testament, abundant wine is the image of the age to come. Isaiah described a day when the Lord of hosts will make a feast for all people, a feast of rich food and well-aged wine. Amos speaks of a time when the mountain will drop sweet wine. Joel says the same. Wine is a picture of joy of the messianic banquet. So when John tells us that wine ran out, he is telling us something larger than a catering failure. The old celebration has reached its limit. The joy has run dry. And the question of the whole chapter presses is, what comes next? The hour that has not yet come. Mary comes to Jesus and says simply, They have no wine. His answer sounds abrupt in English. Women, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Two things are worth clarifying. First, the word translated woman, gainai, in Greek, was not rude. It was a respectful form of address. Jesus uses the same word from the cross when he entrusts Mary to the beloved disciple. But it is notable that he does not say mother. He is signaling that in this moment he is not acting as a Mary's son responding to a family bank request. He is acting under his father's direction and timetable. Second, the word hour in this gospel, hora, is almost a technical term. Again and again, John writes that they could not arrest him because his hour has not yet come. And then in chapter 12, Jesus says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And immediately began speaking about the grain of wheat falling into the ground and dying. In chapter 17, he prays, Father, the hour has come. The hour is the cross. So already at the very first sign, at the wedding party in a small village, Jesus is measuring his action against the cross. Everything in this gospel is oriented towards that hour. Mary does not argue. She simply turns to the servant and says, do whatever he tells you. Those are the last recorded words of Mary in Scripture, and they are a good final word. She steps out of the way and points to him. 6 stone jars. Now watch the detail because John chose them carefully. Now, there were 6 stone jars, water jars, were there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Not wine jar purification jars. These are the vessels used for a ceremonial washing that governs Jewish daily life, washing hands, washing vessels, maintaining ritual cleanness. They are stone rather than clay because stone was considered less susceptible to contracting ceremonial uncleanness. These jars represent the entire system of ritual purity. And they are empty and at least not full because Jesus tells the servant to fill them. Then he says, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. And the servant obey, and the water has become wine. Consider the volume, 6 jars of 20 to 30 gallons. Each is somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons of wine. That is far more than any village wedding could drink. It is not a measured, practical solution to a shortage. It is an extravagance. It is the abundance of the promised age poured out in absurd quantity. And consider what the wine was made from. The water of ritual purification becomes the wine of the wedding feast. The system that could cleanse out the outside of the cup is transformed into the joy of messianic banquet. Jesus does not smash the jars, he fills them and transforms their contents. The law is not discarded, it is brought to what it was always pointing towards. A master of the feast who had no idea what has happened tasted and calls the bridegroom over, puzzled. Everyone serves the good wine first He says the cheap wine later when nobody can tell the difference. But you have kept the good until now. He meant it is the compliment about party management. John recorded because it is a theological statement. God has kept the good wine until now. The best is not behind us in the old covenant. The best has arrived in Jesus. And there is a quiet irony. In the scene, the master of the feast praised the bridegroom, but the real bridegroom in the story is standing off to a side, unrecognized. In the next chapter, John the Baptist will call Jesus exactly that, the bridegroom. When John gives us his summary, this, the first of his sign, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Note the word sign. John does not usually call the event miracle or wonders or display of power. He calls them semia, sign. A sign is not a destination. A sign points away from itself to something else. The miracle at Cana is not fundamentally about wine. It is a finger pointing at who Jesus is. And John tells us what was revealed, his glory, which takes us straight back to chapter 1. We have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father. The temple. After a brief note that Jesus went down to Capernaum with his family and disciple, their scenes changes completely. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. What he found in the temple court was, in one sense, entirely normal. Pilgrims traveling long distance could not bring sacrificial animal with them, so animals were sold on site. Temple dues had been paid in particular currencies, so money changes operated. In principle, these were services that made worship possible, but they were taking place in the court of Gentiles. In the one area of the temple where no non-Jew could come to pray to God of Israel, the only space open to the nation had been turned into a livestock market and the currency exchange. The place meant to declare that God's house would be a house of prayer for all people had become a place of commerce. Jesus makes a whip of cord and drives out the sheep and the oxen. He pours out the coins and overturns a table. To those selling doves, the offering of the poor, he says, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." Notice the phrase, "my Father's house." This is a claim, not a prophet. This is a claim, not a protest. It is not acting as an outraged pilgrim. He is acting as a son with authority in his own family's home. And the disciple watching remembers a line from Psalm 69, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Psalms is a lament of a righteous sufferer who has hated without cause, who bears reproach for God's sake. And John reports the quotation of the future tense, "will consume me." The disciples are seeing zeal, but the psalm is pointing towards what that zeal will eventually cost him. This confrontation is a step on the road to the cross. A brief word about the timing. Matthew, Mark, and Luke place the temple cleansing in the final week of Jesus' ministry. John placed one here at the beginning. Christians who take Scripture equally seriously have understood that this is more than one way. Some conclude that Jesus cleansed the temple twice, at the start and at the end of his ministry, which is not implausible since the abuse would have resumed. Others concluded that John, who arranged his material thematically rather than strictly chronologically, has placed the event here because it belongs at the front of his argument. This is not a point on which one position can be declared and only faithful one. What matters for reading John is the theological function. He wants the temple question raised at the very start because his gospel is going to answer it. Destroying the temple. The authorities demand a sign. What gives you the right to do this? His answer is deliberately opaque. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They hear it literally, and they reply dips with contempt. It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? Herod's renovation of the temple had been underway for decades and was still not finished. The idea is absurd to them. Then John steps in as a narrator and explains, but he was speaking about the temple of his body. This is the hinge of the whole chapter, and one of the central claims of the entire gospel. What was the temple for? It was the place where God's presence dwelled among his people. It was the place where sacrifice was made for sin. It was the meeting point of heaven and earth. And Jesus says, "That is me," which is exactly what chapter 1 already told us. The Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. The tabernacle language. Nathanael will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man, Jacob's ladder, a joining of heaven and earth relocated into a person. Now in chapter 2, the points become explicit. The building in Jerusalem was always a signpost. The reality is standing in the courtyard being interrogated. Notice how it speaks of it. Destroy this temple. It knows they will. I'll raise it up. He speaks of his own resurrection as his own act. This is the first prediction of the cross and resurrection in John's Gospel, and it comes in chapter 2. John adds a note that is quietly honest about the disciple. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciple remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. They did not understand it at that time. Nobody did. Understanding came afterward, on the other side of an empty tomb, looking back. Believing and not being trusted. The chapter ends with 3 verses that are easy to skim past and are actually a warning. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus on this part did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people. The Greek uses the same verb twice. They believed in him, and he did not believe himself to them. That is, he did not commit or entrust himself to them. There is a kind of belief that is impressed by miracle and remains fundamentally uncommitted. A belief that wants what Jesus can produce without wanting Jesus. He can see the difference, and he is not flattered by crowds. He knew that it was man. That is a sober line. He is not naive about human nature, and he does not need anyone to explain to them. He does not become disillusioned with people because he was never under any illusions. And that sets up the next scene perfectly, because the very next thing happens with no break in John's narrative. Is the man named Nicodemus, who has seen a sign and drawn conclusion from them, comes to Jesus by night. How this chapter reveals Christ in Cana. He is giver of joy of the last days, and one who takes the water of the old and exhausting purification system and turns it into wine of the wedding feast, in an abundance nobody asked for and nobody could exhaust. He is the true bridegroom, and unrecognized at his own party. And he is the one who, from the very first sign, is already measuring everything against his hour. In Jerusalem, he is the son with authority in his father's house, the one whose zeal for God's honor will eventually consume him. And he is the true temple, the place where God dwells with his people, the place where sacrifice is made, the meeting point of heaven and earth. When the temple of his body is destroyed, he will raise it in 3 days, and everything the old building signified will be fulfilled in him. Trace the movement of grace through this chapter, and it runs in one direction, as it always does in John. The wine does not appear because anyone earned it or asked correctly. Jesus supplies that the celebration could not supply for itself. The servant who filled the jar did not make the wine. Nothing in this chapter is achieved by human effort. And in the temple, the problem is precisely that religion has become a transaction, something brought and exchanged and sold in one courtyard reserved for the outsiders. Jesus drives the transaction out and then announces that the true meeting place with God will be given, not purchased, when his body is destroyed and raised. The final reflection, chapter 2 of John, leaves us with 2 pictures that belongs together. 6 stone jars filled with brim, standing where religion of washing used to stand, and out of them wine, far more than needed, and better than anything served before. And a temple magnificent and 46 years in building, standing in the shadow of a man who says a point to him, and that when they tear him down, he will rise. Neither picture asks anything about us. In both, the movement is entirely from his side. He supplies that joy that the old order ran out of it. He becomes a place of meeting that the old building could have only picture. And he does not He does it by walking from the third day of his opening week towards the hours when he would be destroyed and raised. The good wine has kept until now, and the one who kept it is the one who was poured out.